Happy New Year, folks! So last year I started out with a series of videos on the Motel 14 laptop that I picked up really cheap as an open box right after Black Friday. And that kind of started a trend on my channel of doing videos of how to do more computing for less. And that was a really good example of far end of the spectrum of how to do it, where by getting something off-brand, usually made in China, you save a lot, and the sacrifices you make are usually build quality and customer service availability. But you can usually get better specs for what you pay than what is usually available at your local brick and mortar retailer. Now, this year I wanted to do a full 180 and show the far opposite end of that spectrum, in laptops at least, of how to compute more for less. And that is to get something that was once top of the line or close to it, that is now starting to fall off the cliff of obsolescence, where it starts to lose driver support and things like that, and so it abruptly drops in price to where you can actually start to look at them in comparison to what you can buy new, and you have to really debate what you're getting versus sacrificing. And it makes it worth looking at something like this, which this is a 2014 Alienware 17, which I guess you'd call it's like the R1 revision B. But the specs on this one are an i7 4th generation 4910MQ with a factory overclock to 4.1 GHz turbo speed. It has 16 gigs of DDR3 1600 MHz RAM, and it has a GeForce 880M, which I'm going to get into more on that later, but NVIDIA just decided to drop driver support for it way back in spring of 2019, so that's the main reason that these things are just plummeting in price, is because that GPU is no longer supported. And even though it was very top of the line and still has a reasonable amount of horsepower, it not being supported for so long is making a lot of games refuse to even run. Now besides that, we'll get into the boring stuff. It's got a Blu-ray drive, woohoo! A 1080p 17-inch screen at 60 Hz. It's got a 256 gig mini PCIe, it's not M2, solid state drive, and it came with a 1 terabyte 5400 RPM slow AF platter drive. So anyway, this is the kind of thing where these are starting to drop into, if you've got one that needs a new battery or has some other things that need done on it like this one, you can get them in the $500 range. Now, comparing those two brand new $500 laptops, sure, it's like this is a big heavy monstrosity, it's getting old, but in that price range you're still going to look at a lot of these newer laptops, and I think the Motel is a good example of that. They'll kind of fool you with their good specs and newer seeming things, but a lot of things on that, and I'll demonstrate, like the screen may say 4K or other things like that. It might have higher end specs in some area, but in areas like color gamut, for example, the Motel and a lot of cheap laptops have they're like a rated 73% sRGB color gamut screen, but they actually come in like somewhere in the mid 60s and they're absolutely terrible. Whereas something like this actually exceeds the sRGB range to put out about 104-105% color accuracy, according to the sRGB range, which is of course not your eyeballs. But these are the kind of things that make laptops like this worth considering versus new ones, because it has all kinds of stuff that comes with it. It has a Blu-ray drive, it has a bunch of ports, but then the drawbacks of this one are it's old, it's heavy, it weighs over 9 pounds, which is one of the big things that I'm going to struggle with throughout working on this. But before me blabbing too much on the intro, let me get into each of these individual subjects. And first, I'm going to start out with the hardware repairs and tweaks and things I needed to do to get this up to snuff. Then I'll go into drivers, which, spoiler, this is a lot of people that may have this laptop and are struggling to find drivers. I have a Google Drive link in the description with the 3 drivers that are hard to find. And also, you're welcome, I modified the current, as of last week, NVIDIA driver to work on this graphics card. So if you have this exact laptop and an 880M and you're struggling, this modified driver will work on this exact laptop and graphics card. Now you can't break your laptop if you have a different one. I've just only whitelisted this exact model and card. So if you download mine, it won't work on an 870M or a different model like an MSI laptop that also has an 880M. I've only done it for this one, and I'm not, you can find the tutorials. I'll link you to the ones I use to create it, but I'm not going to make ones for everyone's individual laptop by request. But hey, I gave you everything that I used to make this one work, so that will be provided in the description, and I'm going to show everything I did. Then finally, I'm just going to test one game. I just, since, Can It Run Cyberpunk, I think, is the new Can It Run Crisis, I decided to test out Cyberpunk on this, so I'm going to demonstrate that, and then we'll get to the conclusion. So without further ado, let's get into my using a 2014 Alienware in 2021.
Inside the laptop, there were a few things that I had to take care of on the hardware side before I could even get started. Now, the first is that this battery was totally toast, and these things actually, on some occasions, these laptops will actually draw from the battery and the huge 220 watt power supply at the same time. But yeah, anyway, dead battery will cause your laptop to even shut off sometimes. And the other is this drive, this 5400 RPM laptop platter drive is honestly, on paper it looks good to have an extra storage drive in this, but in this day and age, a hard drive this slow, the difference of having it inside the laptop versus having it in my handy dandy cardboard and tape portable hard drive enclosure, inside a backpack where I can just easily access it. In order to take a little bit of weight off this thing, which that drive, combined with the two caddies, which there was a caddy in both of these, not only the one with the hard drive, but the empty spot as well, which that's cool of Dell, but all of those together were like a third of a pound. So taking all of those out and just having a portable hard drive rather than a slow, practically worthless platter drive inside this laptop, that alone saved me a good little chunk of weight. Now, the other thing is I got a replacement battery that is smaller capacity. So although having a battery that could, at least pull out 4 hours looked good on paper for Alienware / Dell when they were getting reviews, it really, nobody's ever going to use this thing on the battery. So to shave off a little bit more weight, which that was another third of a pound from that, that was totally worth it to replace it with a lighter battery. And so with those things combined, and with these caddies, I'm trying to look if I can shave anything else off, but I'm just trying to get it down from like a little over 9 pounds to a little over 8 pounds would really make things a lot more reasonable. Now, the other thing that I did is the fans were totally clogged up. So I pulled these guys out and blasted out the heat sinks and cleaned the fans. And again, I always tell people, make sure that you do something to stop the fan blades from spinning while you're cleaning them, because otherwise you can spin them too fast and wear out the motor faster, and it's not good for them. So yeah, cleaned those all out, and I put new thermal paste on the GPU and CPU because it was old and cracked. And I used Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut, which this just for show, I did all this stuff before. But and also before I move on from this section, so in order to get a cooler for a big old 17-inch laptop, they don't make a lot of these anymore, so I keep fixing this Targus one. And this one was getting pretty rough. The cable was ripped out of the top and it was missing the feet, and one of these fans was all seized up. So anyway, I made an entry point and removed a little plastic shroud thing in there that was covering up where the wire went in to the fans and holding the bracket on. So anyway, I replaced one of the fans. These are actually TV bolt spacers from a wall mount that I put on here. And and this got this extra long cable that says Asus on it, so it must be from an old Bluetooth mouse for charging. So yeah, anyway, with these things combined, I covered up my hole with some tape here, got this wonderful cooling stand. So yeah, that should pretty well do it for the hardware section.
Getting your older gaming laptop to this state where nothing is unidentified in the driver panel and you have the newest drivers installed can be more than a bit of a pain sometimes. So let me show just briefly how I did it on this one. Now when you look up drivers on the NVIDIA site for some of these, sometimes you'll notice, oh, it looks like it was discontinued, what seems like fairly early compared to other cards. Now, even sometimes you'll look at other ones in the very same series and see that they still have driver support to this day. Now, sometimes your graphics card is genuinely not supported and that core is no longer supported by driver updates, but a lot of times, like in a case like this, where other ones from the same series still are, it's totally arbitrary and they've just cut it off for whatever reason, but new drivers will completely work with your card. So you're able to modify those and make it so that you can install them on your laptop and get it working. Now, when it comes to one of the devices that doesn't identify, that is the card reader. Now, I was able to just actually find that from Realtek's site. They actually just have drivers that work for all of their card readers still on their current website. So that was much easier than digging around and finding the old ones. Now, as far as the other two things that don't identify, that's the drop sensor and the on-screen display. Once you know what those are, you can just find them on Dell's website. I've included them in the drivers that I have in my file, but you know, if you're looking to see if there are newer ones, once you know what those two things are that won't identify, it's pretty easy to find them. I didn't want to do a ton of benchmarks on an older laptop, but since Cyberpunk 2077 is kind of like the crisis of the moment, I thought I would test that out. But more than that, I just wanted to compare it to the Xbox One and PS4 base systems, since those were released about the same time this laptop was made. And so it's an interesting thing to compare, of if you had bought a $500 gaming console at that time versus a top-of-the-line $3,000 laptop, how much better does this run this game now? The kind of thing you'd be anticipating if you say, okay, you know, 6 years from now, how well am I going to be able to run games? This seems to be the mindset of a lot of people buying these. And so I wanted to compare the settings straight across, and so I used dynamic resolution scaling between 720p and 900p, but unlike the consoles, I capped it at 60 frames instead of 30 frames per second, and I set the target at 40, so that we would actually... Anyway, long story short, we're able to maintain slightly higher resolution and see when we get higher frame rates, which it does in compared to those base consoles. Now, it's interesting. I have to also apologize before even seeing the final video for the artifacting that YouTube is going to introduce. It hates when you use dynamic resolution and frame rate in gameplay, and it's going to just absolutely violate it in its desire to save space with its algorithm. But it does look pretty good, and it's actually a notch above what you'll see on the base consoles. It maintains its 900p much more often, and I have it set for target 40 instead of 30 frames per second, and even then it stays at 900p much more often rather than dropping down to 720p to save frames. And the lowest the frames ever get is momentary drops to 29 in sections like this, where I'm driving through the city in the most scenery and busyness filled areas. And the high is 60. It averages between 35 and 45. But, considering that the console versions struggle to even stay at 30 frames per second and often drop down to 20 or even below that, it's much better than that. And the biggest thing is with the faster memory and storage, things load in faster, and I haven't noticed any of the crashing that seems to be just horribly prevalent in the videos I've seen of the console footage. So I would say it's definitely enough better to be worth it, in that you could say it's playable versus not playable in the opinion of a lot of people. It's still in the 30s and 40s in frame rate, but it's honestly, if that's what you wanted, just to be able to say years down the line you could play a new game and be able to do it better than the consoles, even with all of their optimizations, that is definitely true. Now, how much better? I'd say maybe 30%.
On conclusion on this, as it is right now, and after using it for several months and doing the stuff that I've talked about in this video, I would say it's definitely, much like I've said with cheap laptops with my series of Motile videos, when you get to either far end of the spectrum of what you're trying to do to save money, to punch above your pay grade, you have to really make serious decisions. And that's where it is with this one. Even with the stuff I did of putting in a lighter battery, removing the basically useless platter drive, I lost a little less than a pound. I'm at about 8.3 pounds now, and sorry I couldn't get a good shot of weighing it. It was an awkward maneuver, let me just say that. But even with everything I've done, and now I was able to modify drivers and get the newest drivers on there, you look at what you can actually do with this, and does it run Cyberpunk better than an Xbox One or PS4 that you could have bought at this, the same time this was purchased for about 1/10 of the price, or a little more than that, like 1/6 of the price, something like that. Yes, it runs Cyberpunk significantly better. I mean, it's only about, 30% better frame rates, and at times the resolution drops to the same when I use dynamic, or the same frame rates if I don't use dynamic resolution scaling. So, I mean, we're talking by degrees. It doesn't crash, it runs much more consistently and loads a lot faster, but all of these are pretty minor things considering you could have now upgraded to a newer Xbox or PlayStation and you'd still be well under the cost of buying one of these. So yes, you can buy a $3,000 gaming laptop and 6 years later you can still run new games and still a bit better than you could on a game system you could have bought for the same time. But that really honestly shows the value proposition of gaming consoles versus PCs. And I mean, I hate to say go big or go home because obviously that's the opposite of my philosophy. But something to be aware of is that unless you get above a certain point in computing for just raw fidelity and ability to play the games, it's hard to get above the value proposition that a console offers of you buy it for, between $300 and $500, and it's pretty much guaranteed to play new games for the length of the console. So how much better this plays games this many years later, it's a bit better, and there's a lot of games on this that will run a lot better because of the much larger VRAM buffer, like games, online games like Overwatch, World of Warcraft, League of Legends, stuff like that, where it's just blasting the VRAM, loading in all kinds of stuff, and that's what causes it to chug. That's where having that 8 gigs of VRAM is going to be a big advantage even after all these years because it was so overspec'd for the time. But then when it comes to something like Cyberpunk, where we're just trying to get frame rates and we're turning off every single feature we can, again, it doesn't crash because it doesn't have those just horrible hits that the consoles can't take with their slow memory and slow drives and everything. But when it comes to just frame rates and resolution, you're only a little bit better than what the old consoles that were released at about the same time as this laptop can do. So that's really what you're looking at, and again, I figured out all this stuff with the driver. So if you have this laptop and you're able to just download mine, then it's not that difficult. But if you look around and find all the people who have not successfully managed to get new drivers on these and similar ones, it can be a bit of a pain, and I spent a bit of a time figuring it out. So I think what I really am showing with these videos, and I got that Motile really cheap. It was $281 as an open box because it was based on the Black Friday pricing was still active, even though they weren't available at Walmart anymore at the time. I got my open box for $281 because the M142 was going for $300 at the time. This one, I got this donated by my uncle. It needed a bunch of work and TLC at the time, but he donated it to my channel for me to mess around with and make these videos. So what I'm saying is that basically by getting these really, really cheap, I can kind of afford to mess with them and not feel like I'm destroying. If I bought this new and I was messing around with this stuff, I would feel like a complete idiot if I broke something. So I'm able to kind of demonstrate it's like, okay, this is how great it can be of this thing that you can buy this for like, $400 or $500 if it's like this where it needs a battery and stuff like that. And then you can get it to play Cyberpunk. And that's awesome. But then on the other hand, I'm going to show a few of the drawbacks and some of the pain of trying to use a computer that's this old. And, I'm going to demonstrate some of that. So I guess I'm doing it so that you don't have to. And it was definitely most of the negative comments that I got on the Motile videos were from people who it's like, I always say just don't be friggin' tribal. Like don't and don't be like cultish about your things. Like as great as it is when we all have the same device and we love it, people would be like, the Motile is the greatest, I love it, it's the only laptop I have, how dare you point out any flaws in it? It's like, it's a generic Walmart brand laptop. Let's be realistic, it's going to have some flaws. I mean, I really enjoyed messing around with that laptop, but you have to be realistic that there are going to be drawbacks. You're not going to get something, the people that are like, this is better than a MacBook Pro in every way. You're just like, okay, what are you smoking? So there's going to be a lot of that with this one too, where it's like, even if this thing was $3,000, if you're someone that paid, $3,200 for this years ago, and you're going to be mad if I point out that it's like, well, it's kind of fallen off the cliff now. It's like, well, that's the reality. So I'm going to point out some of that by demonstration as I do a few more videos with this, like upgrading. I had to do a quick edit there. Vivica came home and the dogs got very excited. But let me just wrap up. So I'm going to be doing a few follow-ups to this, like adding a really super cheap 1 terabyte solid state drive and, showing the performance of those ultra cheap solid states and how, if that's a viable solution for a backup versus other things you might do. And then I'll do a more in-depth on games that try to lock you out from running on older hardware and some of the workarounds and things about that, of how you get it to run or why you have to wait for a patch and how it has a lot to do with them. A short version, you'll notice any game that claims that it requires new hardware is almost always some game that has a promotion with NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel. Funny how that is. And then after that initial period is over, they always find some way to patch that requirement out. So yeah, I'm going to do a video on that and a few other things on using an older laptop like this, and I'll just, I'll do a little video series like I did with the Motile, and then who knows, maybe this year I'll even be able to afford a brand new laptop that's not the ultra cheap, and I'll show something that's like a middle ground product that is probably what I think most sane people should do if they don't want to find themselves in the sort of hijinks that I do here for entertainment and traffic on my channel as their normal computing existence and how they get their laptop working. So yeah, watch what I do and laugh. Don't do what I do unless you're trying to entertain people rather than compute. So again, Happy New Year. I'm back and creating a bunch of new content, and you will be seeing a lot of it soon.